Hello everybody and welcome. Welcome to today's edition of Diversity and Inclusion in the Workplace, with today's focus being on equity and equality, equity versus equality, should I say. This is an initiative of diversify.no, who are one of Norway's premier providers of DEI, diversity, equity, diversity, equality and inclusion training. So my name is Hyacinth Walters Olsen. I will be your moderator for this event today. I'm saying hi from Oslo, Norway, from Holmlia in Oslo, Norway. Super excited. We've got some fantastic speakers who I will ask to introduce themselves shortly. But in the interim, I'd just like to give you some information about this event. So, this is not a performance. It's actually a conversation. So guys, put your cameras on, get involved. Next to the chat, there's some reactions, emoticons. I would like you to join in with the emoticons throughout the conversation. Let us know if there's a particular point that has stood out to you. By all means, you can react with a hand up or a smiley face or something like that. But we'd also invite you to ask questions in the comment box. We'll ask everybody to mute your microphones throughout the conversation, but we'll ask you to turn your cameras on just so that we can see who we're having a conversation with. And if you're going to connect with us, which we'll ask you to do throughout the 2 hours of this event, if you're going to ask us a question, please please let us know that it's a question by saying question and then asking your question. And please, if you're asking a question, please make it as short as possible, because I have had to read editions of War and Peace. Sometimes that's not very easy when you're moderating an event. So please keep your questions brief and be concise. And if you're commenting, let us know, if something has made an impact or something's an aha moment. We like to know that, these events are making a difference. So welcome everybody today. So I would now ask our speakers to introduce themselves, and I will start with Chisholm.
Hi everyone. My name is Chisom Udeze. I am the founder of Diversify, the organization hosting this event. Diversify is a nonprofit that works to advocate for professional development, mental health and wellness, and community building for people of immigrant backgrounds, and also for repats and I think the wider society. I am also the founder of Her Space. It's a co-working community for women and mothers in Oslo, Norway. So I'm happy to be here with Hyacinth, Astrid, and Ezekiel, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I thank you all for taking the time in this day and time to join us. So yeah, looking forward.
Thank you very much, Chisholm. Ezekiel, can we come to you?
Absolutely. So nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invite. My background, I'm a lawyer by education, both in England, and I got my master's degree in Norway from the University of Oslo. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Accountants in England and Wales, and I spent most of the first part of my career running essentially corporate investigations. I worked on the House of Commons expenses scandal, looking at valuing the fraud committed by members of Parliament in the UK and how much they owed back to taxpayers. I also worked on Lehman Brothers in administration, so investigating bond trading at the time when they went under. At that point, my career changed, and I became the Chief Compliance Officer and a Senior Vice President at Yara International. So as many of you know, headquartered in Oslo. And it was at that point that we had really, I think, three main priorities with Yara. Number one was to deal with the corruption scandal that was ongoing at the company. This was 2012, 2013. So we had to deal with the issue at hand. Number two, we needed to do additional self-reporting and all of the follow-up processes that come out of a scandal like that. And thirdly, not leastly, we had to build an ethics and compliance program, and that involved everything from culture and tone at the top through to business partner integrity and all sorts of other areas of compliance. I've also been a senior vice president and chief compliance officer at Volvo Group, based in Sweden. And then I came back to consulting. I set up my own firm based out of the UK. So I'm sitting in Edinburgh today. And we help companies with all sorts of ethics, compliance, and ESG topics. So environmental, social, and governance. Delighted to be here today. I hope that wasn't too long an introduction.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. Just lets us know we're in good hands today. And Astrid, we'll come to you to close out.
Yeah, thank you. As well, thank you for the pleasure of being a panelist here today. My name is Astrid Warmington Sundberg. I'm a Scandi Brit. I have an English dad and a Norwegian mum. I grew up in England, but I've been based in Norway for about 10 years now. Prior to moving here, my career in the UK at least was working within the global recruitment industry. I have a background in law and business with a bachelor's degree from the University of Birmingham in England, where I lived for almost 20 years, a postgraduate in coaching, and 25 years experience within leadership roles where I've more or less specialized in human resources and recruitment. And I think this is where diversity, equity, and inclusion have been very central themes to my work. As well as a personal passion of mine, you could say. So where I am currently is at Shortcut. I'm their Chief HR Officer here in Oslo. They're a tech company and the biggest producer of mobile apps in the Nordics. Those of you who are based in Oslo might use the Ruterreise app or things like Vips or and those are the kind of products we've been involved in making. I've spent the majority of my career on leadership teams where I'm frequently the only woman in the room. So I'm a big supporter of women in the workplace, and I'm also a Google qualified facilitator of an initiative called I'm Remarkable. This is a workshop that I run on a voluntary basis, actually, to support women and underrepresented groups with building their self-promotion skills in the workplace.
Well,
thank you again for the invite to be here today.
Wow, thank you so much, Astrid. So as you can all hear, we have some phenomenal speakers lined up for you today. Just a little bit more information for you. This event is also being live streamed on Facebook. So you'll be able to watch it again on Diversify's page. We'll be able to share it as well with colleagues and with friends and family. So I'll just introduce myself, a very brief introduction. As I said, my name is Hyacinth Walters-Olsen, most recently the CEO of Fotobarn RS here in Oslo. I moved here from the UK 3.5 years ago, and I originally started with that company as a project manager and was promoted to CEO within 10 months. My background really has been in business development. I worked for a franchise organization in the UK as a business development consultant, and I have founded and launched several projects of my own, one of which was a finalist for an award within the first 12 months of operation. So yes, very much a champion of diversity and equality and inclusion myself. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in. I've prepared lots of very interesting questions I'm going to ask the panelists today. Like I said, please engage. If you've got any questions that arise out of any of the answers that you hear today, then put them in the comments box and I will come around to you. Right, so I'm going to start with Chisholm. So Chisholm, could you introduce the concepts of equality and equity, are they interchangeable within the construct of diversity and equality and inclusion, sorry?
Yes, thank you, Hyacinth, for the question. I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible, but equality and equity are often used as synonyms, but they're actually quite different. Equality means giving everyone the same thing or resource, whereas equity means giving people what they need. The implementation of equity or equality can lead to dramatically different outcomes for those involved. Equity is attainable not by treating everyone equally, but by treating everyone according to their situations. So how does equity fit within the construct of diversity and inclusion? One of the ways I like to think about it, to keep it quite simple, is imagine that diversity and inclusion is on a continuous straight line. Equality and equity are points along that line. So oftentimes when diversity and inclusion is discussed, it is usually from the point of view of talent attraction, retention, and advancement. Nonetheless, D&I should actually be discussed from the point of view of what a truly diverse company looks like. So this means assessing it from a truly holistic and sustainable point of view. So back to my assertion of D&I existing on a straight line. The first point on that line is diversity. It is a science, it is quantifiable. So think about the type of talent you want to attract at all levels of the organization. Think ethnicity, religion, gender, identity, sexual orientation, disability, and other diversity parameters. You can easily quantify what percentage of your workforce is one or the other. The next point on that line is inclusion. An inclusive work environment is one in which the leaders encourage, empower, and everyone to share their contributions. One in which employees feel, they are valued through positive reinforcement, capacity building, adequate resource allocation, and clear expectations. Employees should feel seen, they should feel heard, and this is not quite a science as diversity is. I like to think of it as an art because it's hard to quantify. So the next point on that line is equality. When our employees are empowered, when they know that they can come as they are because they are accepted, they will bring their unique thoughts and ideas to the table because they know they're being valued equally and they have access to resources. So if diversity, inclusion, and equality are done right, then equity becomes a natural evolution. So equity, I like to think about it as a state of being rather than a point or a step. It looks different at different levels of society and workplaces. So of course, there's no blueprints to how it should look. Nonetheless, for each organization, you must be able to describe what equity looks like using specific example that is relevant to your company. So achieving equity is not a walk in the park. You cannot get there without achieving diversity, inclusion, or equality. But once attained, it leads to, better employee engagement, higher retention rates, and better business outcomes. So just to bring it back to an example from a social point of view that everyone here might be able to relate to, let's look at the situation with the coronavirus today. Now, I know we're all from different parts of the world, but if we all imagine that we're currently in Oslo, but we still come from different parts of the world, we speak different languages. Equality would be to hold a community or municipal-wide meeting where everyone living in Oslo is invited. Information about COVID-19 health concerns and mitigation strategies will be presented by the authorities. But this session is only held in Norwegian, whereas Norwegian is not the primary language for, say, 20% of the population. Equity will be in play when community leaders hire translators to attend the meeting or offer additional meetings or information packets in other languages represented. So just a quick shout out before I conclude to Norway. I should mention here that the Norwegian government has been quite remarkable in this regard. Not only are they providing relevant information in multiple languages in Norway with regards to COVID-19, they are also enabling organizations and nonprofit organizations with grants and resources to reach an even wider net of people. So just to conclude, I think it is important to state here that acknowledging the difference between equality and equity is important in just about every sphere of socio-economic and political life, including, healthcare, education, racial justice, politics, and much more.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your answer, Chisholm. Johan, just want to let you know I've seen your question. Thank you for posing it. We might be covering that in some of the questions that I'm going to ask the panel, but if not, then we'll cover that a bit later on. Okay, so Chisholm, thank you so much for that answer. I really love the visual of the line, being able to, visualize that. I think that was really helpful for quite a lot of people. So just going to quickly move on over to Astrid. And Astrid, there's a very clear demarcation here with all three panelists, because Chisholm's coming at this from the perspective of being an employer and also provider of DEI training. Astrid as being, an experienced H&R, human resources professional, and then Ezekiel from a compliance perspective. So I really love that we've covered quite a broad spectrum here. So Astrid, your question is really tailored towards your HR perspective. So as a leader, from your perspective as a leader, what are the benefits for workplaces in promoting diversity, equality, and inclusion?
The benefits for leaders are, well, it's as simple as this. Employees love things that will benefit them and their work environment. And this is exactly what DEI does. It's about valuing differences in people, not only hiring people who look and think like you. And I can say with 25 years experience that I've definitely seen more harmony and tolerance, more compassion, more understanding in the workplaces that have been very diverse. And if it sounds like I'm being too utopian here, I would like to reference the business case for diversity, equity and inclusion, which shows quite overwhelmingly that it boosts innovation. In 2017, for example, the Global Human Capital Trends report, which was a Deloitte report based on a survey of 245 different organizations across the globe, showed that those organizations with diverse and inclusive cultures are 6 times more likely to be innovative. And that a diverse employee base gives you a diverse set of experiences, perspectives, and backgrounds. And that's what leads to an innovation. It's crucial to people and teams for the development of new ideas. The idea behind this is that when you have voices that are multiple and varied, they bring with them different experiences. And this can create a sort of collaborative impact when designing, making apps, discovering or inventing. And the other benefit of diverse teams, and I think Chisholm, you touched on this really a little bit, is that I believe it helps to attract diverse talent. When a potential employee sees others that look like them in the room, then I think it makes them more likely to feel like they would fit in there. I can give you one example of something we do at Shortcut. It's only a small thing we do, but we employ 30 different nationalities in total. And in our Oslo office, 30 of our 73 employees are non-Norwegian and almost 30% are from an ethnic minority group. We have a huge map on the wall, and this was an employee that came up with this idea. She might even be here today, actually. And we had pins and strings and photos on the end of it, really just to show the diversity. And this visual picture is very, very impactful when you walk into the room. It also helps when we have candidates on interview who can see the breadth of diversity that we have at Shortcuts. And I think in that respect, it attracts others with the same kind of mindset. There are a lot of millennials in tech who want to work in diverse workplaces. On a final note, in answer to this question of the benefits for workplaces, I think it's also important to reference one of the most extensive recent studies that's been done by McKinsey on diversity. And this was a piece of research called Diversity Matters. It was a global study that examined almost 400 public companies across a sort of range of industries. Now, the crucial finding from this study was that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity were 35% likely to be more profitable than those who weren't. And the reason that this 2015 piece of research became so important and so prevalent is because it was essentially proof for the company leaders who didn't already know it, many already did, in the unquestionable link between diverse workforces and increased profits.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you. So sticking with you, Astrid, could you, I know you gave us an example of what you guys have been doing in Shortcut, but as a HR professional, could you give our participants today examples of what other companies could do to help their team members feel a greater sense of belonging and inclusion and equity?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I mean, when it comes to belonging, there's a really great quote that I love, and it's by the Queen, that is Brené Brown, and she says this, and this really captures it beautifully. Belonging doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. And belonging revolves around this sense of being yourself, you know, you being you, feeling accepted and included by other people around you. You know, cognitive psychologists have discovered that the pain of not belonging even follows the same neurological, physiological patterns as physical pain. So that's how significant it is. And one of the things we've done in Shortcut is that we've invested in an employee listening work tool. And this is where we can actually measure the sense of belonging felt by our employees. So if you're wondering what an employee listening work tool is, it's a digitalized way of getting feedback from employees. In our case, we have it integrated to Slack, which is a communication vessel that we use. And it's based around weekly anonymous pulse surveys, which feed into a dashboard, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. So we can measure things like engagement or the sense of belonging of our employees through what I would describe as real-time data. It sort of gives us scores and percentages. And we have, at least for the moment, a really high score in the area of ambassadorship. And ambassadorship is the extent to which employees feel a sense of pride in the company and the extent to which they talk positively about us or recommend us to a friend. It's 80% at the moment, which is really pleasing. So employee listening, a work tool like this, it enables you to collect the feedback of employees. You can also do it across demographic groups, and it can provide a really interesting digitalized and data-driven solution that not only helps you measure, but of course take action as well. When it comes to inclusivity, this is a really interesting one as well for me, because you can't have the positive ratios of women and minority ethnic groups if you don't consider how to include them. And I think someone once famously said, Werner Myers, I think, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And that's exactly how I think we should see inclusivity. And what it really means is that having a diverse workforce is one thing. You know, it might look good on paper, but for it to really work, for it to ebb and flow as well and as seamlessly as possible, you have to look at all the small elements of inclusivity. So let me try and give you an example. What about your summer party? Does the whole party revolve around alcohol? Or does it include employees who don't drink alcohol? What about the food you serve? Is it a meat feast, or does it include vegetarians or people who don't eat certain meats for religious reasons? Other examples around inclusivity could be where women are in the minority in the workplace, having access to things like period products, or arranging events and meetings and times that take into account parents or single parents, even more so. One of the things that we've done, which I think is really easy for any company to do, is we enable our employees to swap holidays from the Christian calendar to religious days that fall under their calendar, whether it's Eid or Yom Kippur or Diwali. And this is really easy to implement. It's really inclusive to enable people to feel that their religious cultural days can be celebrated and respected. And I think it's something that every person can do. My last example on inclusivity, and I have a lot of experience here on a personal level, it would be inclusivity of conversations. I should know a lot more than I do about wine, golf, football, cars, cognac and craft beer, because there's been a lot of conversations around those things when you work with a lot of guys. And I would never expect someone to change the conversation about a hobby on my behalf. But I think it is important to tailor conversations in group settings to make them inclusive. Because if they're not inclusive, it can make people feel invisible. And if people start to feel that invisibility, then it affects their motivation, their engagement, and ultimately productivity and retention. So just being conscious of who is in the room, who you're sitting eating lunch with, and how they are being included in the conversation is a small but really significant gesture. I haven't gotten to equity yet, but I feel I've spoken a lot, Hyacinth. You want me to come back to that?
Oh, no, you know what? Your answer was fantastic. You've given so many great tips, examples, lots to chew on there. So that was fantastic. No, thank you. I mean, we'll be coming back round to you, so I'm sure you'll be giving us loads more. Guys, we have just started. We're like 3 questions in, and already the content that's being provided in the conversation is phenomenal. So Ezekiel, will move forward to yourself. So from looking at diversity and inclusion in the workplace, what might the cost be to an organization if they are indifferent or negligent?
So I think just echoing what Astrid said about this really mattering is probably a good starting point. And during my various roles, we've done a lot of employee surveys, particularly ethics surveys, on what is it that matters to each individual in the organization. And what you find is that respect in the workplace is actually about twice as important as things like salary. I know the statistics for Norway, I looked them up before attending this, were about 52%. Who said that respect in the workplace was the single most important factor. The next closest one was actually 25%, which was salary. So we know that this is top of individuals' agendas. A lot of my work probably touches on quite extreme examples of how cultures go wrong. So I would preface these comments with they're highly unusual and probably not, a benchmark for every organization. During the Yara case, many people were arrested. Several people were charged with criminal offences, and 4 former executives were charged with gross corruption. And those cases against the individuals went to court. In the court case, one of the focus areas was of course culture. How can corrupt acts happen in an otherwise good culture? It's quite unlikely. And in that cultural discussion, there was reference to an A team and a B team. And the A team, they took all the important decisions, and they were keeping all of the nice information for themselves. The B team was locked out. They didn't get all of the information, and this created some really odd incentives. It created a very strange set of cultural values. And you can see some of these. We're only going to have this conversation if certain people are locked out. The incentives within the B team are very strange. Things like, I will do anything to get into the A team. I'll do anything to be in the room when that decision gets made. I think also in group discussions, you're clearly not seeing the whole picture in that A team and B team. Certain perspectives aren't being brought. And this was really costly to that group of individuals, clearly. Overall, as a chief compliance officer, then, one of the focuses is on setting the right culture. And it's actually the starting point. Before you do anything else, we look at tone at the top. So cascading all the way from the CEO and the board, what do you want? What do you mean about this when we talk about culture? And we don't actually do anything else until we've set that tone. Until that's right, we don't put any structures, any policies in place until we've had that conversation and everyone is saying, yep, this is the way we're going to go. Then you can do the other stuff. You can do the investigations, you can do the risk assessments, but that is the starting point. The culture is the starting point. And when we talk about culture, we're not talking about vague kind of ethereal things. We need to be extremely concrete. When I say ethical culture, I want everyone in the room to have an exact knowledge of what that means. So firstly, the first element, there are 5 that I talk about in the programs that I've set up for companies and my clients now. There are 5 elements. First one is leadership, and we're looking there for leaders walking the talk. So I want them to be demonstrating the behavior that they are committed to. When I talk about leaders, I also talk about line managers, because that's another major influence in many employees' feelings about work and many employees' experiences of the workplace is their direct line manager. So I also want line managers to be promoting integrity and values in everything they do. A lot of companies have mission, a mission, vision, values set, and that's got to be meaningful. In terms of leadership, that has to be set right, and we can maybe dig into that later on. The second point is clarity. So the expectations on behavior have to be clear. Things like a written code of conduct are really important, and that training is given on behaviors and expectations. And that fits into that saying, educate before you indict. We really can't judge anyone until we've shared, what it is we wanted from them. The third characteristic of culture that we really push in organizations, and this is very linked to diversity and inclusion. The third one is trust and openness. So the decisions that are made in the organization should be made transparently, and there's an ability to kind of solve issues as a team together. So one of the things I would look for when I was visiting a site would be, is this team, when I sit in on your team meeting, are you able to challenge each other? Are you able to talk about concepts like right and wrong without getting offended? That's really important for trust and openness. Fourth is a really difficult one on accountability. So we always want people to be saying, you know, if there's a problem, it's not swept under the carpet, and it's not quietly tolerated. It's actually dealt with. I was speaking with someone who was very high up in the US military, and he said on accountability, he said, the organization knows. If there's an issue, the organization knows. And if you don't discipline, the organization knows. So we must take those hard decisions as well on accountability. And finally, the fifth element of an ethical culture is around speak up. And this is able to raise questions through either your line manager or someone else, or in an extreme circumstance, those secure anonymous reporting channels. And that's really where on the other end of the line would be probably someone like me, who would be able to investigate something independently. And one of the biggest challenges there, and a theme that's going to come out, I think, in the next 2 years, is around retaliation. This poison to many cultures, and legislation is coming in which makes this much harder to get away with. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that develops. I think just circling back from all of those comments, just back to that Yara case and the A team and the B team, they got a few things wrong, that's very clear, but there were 3 main failures centering on diversity and inclusion. Firstly was a moral failure. They clearly didn't do the right thing. And that was obvious. I don't think that needs too much argument behind it. There was a moral failure there. There was an economic failure. You know, they weren't attracting and retaining the best people. And, you know, many of the employees who were very proud to work for the company at the time simply walked away. So they lost people. Students who were responding to surveys didn't rate the company as a desirable employer. That has vastly changed now, and you know, Yara is doing remarkable things in that way. And finally, you know, there was this cultural failure. Good decisions weren't being made, and there was low commitment. Whistleblowing went through the roof, and I think we really see from that one example all the cultural failures that are possible in ignoring diversity and inclusion.
Wow, that was gosh, you know, losing key team members, employees, you know, cultural failure. See, right. There's, you know, some real I was almost going to say some real what's the word? It's just flown out of my mind. Losses, really. For companies.
Some real consequences there.
Yeah, consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
There we go. The word was like flew away, gained wings and flew away. Thank you so much. That was really thrilling to hear all of that information. So I'd just like to take this to Chisholm as an employer. Because now we've heard it from Ezekiel, who's talking about compliance from the perspective of tackling it from the top down, which I think is fantastic, because quite often, in my opinion, organizations look at diversity and inclusion from the bottom up. How can we make our team this rather than leading from the top down? So as an employer, Chisholm, what constitutes indifference and negligence to yourself?
That's an interesting question. Trying to gather my thoughts, but I think I can start by saying that many companies talk a lot about supporting diversity and inclusion, but it's really hard to know if they actually mean it. I personally think that the time to talk about diversity and inclusion and toss out, you know, fluffy words, really nice sentiments that is not backed by action was in 2019, because after the 2020 we've had, it is negligent to not have begun taking measurable steps on the long but necessary journey towards a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace. And as an employer, from that perspective, I think it is important that what a company is actually doing to achieve a more diverse and inclusive workforce, like it should be known. And it is even more essential to know that when a company hires diverse candidates, that their contributions are valued. So if we look at what constitutes indifference or negligence, I think not consciously and intentionally doing all you can to hire a diverse workforce, not learning about the needs of your employees and and meeting them to the best of your ability, not valuing each person equally, not meeting your employees where they are, that is negligence. And if we look at indifference, I think indifference, it just really manifests by not caring, thinking you don't have a problem, you know, like, oh, I don't need diversity, or we're diverse enough, you know, or just thinking that, you know, this whole diversity and inclusion drive no longer applies to you. And I think this is often compounded by bias, be it overt or implicit and unconscious bias, because they play a role in negligence. And I think that unconscious bias, because it's something we all have, if you think you don't have it, you know, you're in dreamland, we all have it, but left unchecked, it also happens to be one of the biggest disablers to diversity and inclusion. So just, I guess if I could put 3 concrete points or examples down, I think that as a company, you are negligent or indifferent when there is a lack of flexible work policies. You know, this could be something as simple as remote work or flexible scheduling where possible. I know that this is not always possible for some industries, like in construction or in the medical field. But also something as important as healthcare, parental leave for both mothers and fathers, or mental health of your employees. I think the second act of negligence or indifference is when a company is homogeneous, when everyone looks the same. And this is quite easy to decipher. If you visit a company's website on LinkedIn page and go through their actual living team members, it shows individuals or leaderships. Well, if it shows individuals or leaderships from like the same ethnicity, race, gender, then there is a lack of diversity across the organization. You know, it's a well-known fact that within the D&I space, that for diversity to work, there needs to be buy-in from senior level management. Astrid has said it, Ezekiel has said it. You know, so if top level management are from a homogeneous group, there is scarcity of attention and respect for important aspects of inclusion. And the third point I would like to make here is that for companies, you do not take D&I seriously if you blame the pipeline. So claiming that there is a lack of readily available talent pool is no longer an acceptable answer if you're not doing something on the side to make a difference. You know, so what I'm trying to say here is that it is important that you improve focus on diversifying the hiring process. I know that there are some industries that it's really just difficult to get the right gender balance or the racial balance, who knows. But it's also important to explore new sources to find candidates. You need to remove barriers and start recruiting talents that are different from your current pool of employees or who do not necessarily fit the A4 typecast that you are accustomed to. You know, ask yourself, is everyone in the room? If the answer is no, then you need to go get people into the room who are gay, who are Muslim, who are brown, who are non-binary, people without university degrees, or people who've taken a career break. Do this, and then you can be less negligent or indifferent.
Wow, fantastic. Wow, thank you for your engagement, guys. I'm loving the questions are flying in, hitting me. We're going to come to these questions. Thank you so much. So much more content to come out of these questions. I will ask our panelists to have a read through the questions so that we can answer them later on. Just to keep yourselves abreast of what the questions that are coming in, I will ask you those. So touching on bias in the hiring processes, let's go to our HR specialist, Astrid. How can employers get rid of bias in their hiring or recruitment processes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Hyacinth. Thank you. It's actually something that I touch on in my I Am Remarkable workshop, and you know, there is a whole discussion to be had here on subconscious bias. But don't worry, Chiz, I'm not going to go into that, because I know that's going to be discussed at a future workshop. You happened to mention that to me yesterday. But when it comes to bias in recruitment processes, I've seen it. I mean, I've been working in recruitment since my early career, and I you know, I've even had experience with customers in you know, back in the 90s, that were specifying, don't want a woman for this, it needs to be a white person for this role. I still remember, as a much younger woman, really like losing my shit with a potential customer who wasn't a customer after that, who was specifying you know, some pretty disgusting racist requirements. And I'm going to mention a study that was done in 2003 as a reference to this point on bias in recruitment processes, because Marianne Bertrand and Sandil Mullainathan did an experiment that looked into bias within the selection process in America. It was an extensive study that used identical CVs for men and women, but changed the names. So in their experiment, they used Emily and Greg, typical white sounding names. And then they used, these were names that were very popular in 2003, apparently, Lakeisha and Jamal, for more African-American sounding names. And what the study showed was that the CVs with the more white sounding names were over 30% more likely to be called back for interview. And even the companies in their experiment who listed themselves as you know, equal opportunities employers, they were just as likely as those who didn't have equal opportunities policies to reject the African-American sounding names. Now, there's been tons of studies done since then, and lots of companies and public sector organizations have trialed things like blind recruitment. I'll come back to that. But I think, as someone who's worked with recruitment process in 1996, I have seen the unpleasant side of it, of course, and it's a bit harder to spot now, I think, than it was 20 years ago, because we're so digitalized, and it's harder to spot perhaps exclusion or bias because of things like LinkedIn. You know, LinkedIn is a massive vehicle that so many companies use for their recruitment procedures. And I think one of my biggest bugbears as a recruiter, or rather something that anyone that's in a company out there can do, is to look at the language they use on their job advertisements. I think this is a really important place to start when it comes to eliminating bias. Now, I've been writing job adverts for many years. It's quite a creative part of the job, and you know, you have to use adjectives and make it sound very passionate. But many years ago, we were told to be very conscious of all biases, and especially hidden biases like subtle nods towards age discrimination. And the UK and the States, I think, have been really good in this area with the sort of language used in advertisements. I'm going to mention Norway, a country that I love, in a less positive light here, because since I moved here 10 years ago, I've definitely been shocked at reading some of the adverts here, a little bit provoked to see things like stipulations that you have to have Norwegian as your mother of tongue language. The reason that shocks me is because I don't think that is okay. I think it's discriminatory. I think it's more or less saying if you come from another country or a bilingual home, or if you speak Norwegian with a dialect, which I do, even though my mother is Norwegian, I definitely have a British dialect when I speak Norwegian. So yeah, that's something I've come across that that I don't think is okay. I think it's biased, and I think that there's a lot of work that can be done there. The other ism that I've seen in adverts here is ageism. A lot of adverts stipulating the year's experience, that the person must be a young, fresh graduate, where it as good as says we only want a young person for the role. And I don't feel this is inclusive to graduates or more mature people. What about people who've entered the career field later on in life? I've got a lot of female friends who raised their children first and then went on to build careers later. So they would have been older when they went to university to study. And what about people that have midlife crises and change careers? That happens a lot. I once refused to deal with a recruiter actually, who I won't mention the name because that would be mean. But he was selling me his services, and he proudly told me that he only dealt with candidates between the age of 25 and 35. And needless to say, I don't do business with him. I don't want to do business with people that don't have inclusive recruitment programs, and so don't work with people who don't promote the same values as you. And the last point here, I mentioned blind recruitment processes. If you're a large company, or if you're part of a large company with global recruitment programs, or if you're part of a D&I panel, or if you have an interest in this area, then you can talk to your company about embracing blind application processes. I've seen some great examples of this earlier on in my career when I worked with Birmingham City Council and Hackney Borough Council, who were some of the early adopters of this method of blind recruitment processes. And what it essentially means is no photo, no age, no name, anything that could identify anything to do with that person would be removed from the CV. And the idea here is that a blind process hides characteristics that people could have a subconscious bias against, and that therefore would make it a fairer process. That's the thinking here. So those are my thoughts on bias in the recruitment process, and especially the part about language in job advertisements, because I speak to a lot of people who are either new in Norway or who have relocated here, who speak Norwegian, but they're still on this journey to get their Norwegian up to a good level. And I know that people can feel really deflated when the first sentence says you must have Norwegian as your native tongue. It just feels very, very exclusionary, I think, when you read that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm one of those people who's got a definite accent when I speak Norwegian. Just want to look at some of the comments. Anthony Hutchins is saying, yes, he agrees. He unfortunately still sees job postings from professional recruiters and HR people that are actively discriminatory in their language. Nora was saying the study that you mentioned earlier, Astrid, with the CVs, that there was a similar study done here in Norway with equally as shocking results. We've got people joining us from around the world today, so please share with us if there's some tips that you've seen companies or your own company does, or you've seen other companies do in your country that you think could be of value and use to this network of people here. Then share those tips with us, tips that you think employers could use in, for example, their recruitment processes that you think work well. So just going to move along, and I'm going to come back to you, Ezekiel, for looking at compliance. And, we often hear that a company's values are only as strong as those of its employees. So how can companies create and enforce an effective code of conduct?
Good. So I think start with two main points about kind of what we're trying to achieve with a code of conduct. I think firstly, it's a structure that gives clarity, kind of sets down your fundamental rules. But secondly, and more importantly, it sets a behavioural norm. And that behavioural point is really, really important. When you look at sort of, let's take corruption and its appearance in different countries. There have been some really interesting pieces of work on kind of why does corruption still happen in some countries, in spite of the fact that they've got all of the correct kind of laws and policies, institutions in place. And the conclusion of that research anyway is that it's about a social norm, and that it's a set of behaviors which is kind of observed and repeated. And so when we put a code of conduct in place, we are also trying to say, look, these are the social norms that we want people to follow, and that to kind of build upon itself. As a structure, I mean, the mere presence of a code of conduct is also really, really important. So if you have a set of university students taking a test and you write at the top of the test paper, you know, please bear in mind the honour code of this university, you'll find there's a lot less cheating. So the mere timely reminder of, you know, some sort of code of conduct is really valuable. I draft a lot of codes of conduct for people, and they all want different things. That's fine. You know, there are different risks that present themselves in different organizations. Some of them have really suffered from corruption. Some of them have, you know, huge competition law issues. They might have harassment and kind of bullying issues in their organization. So each of them wants to kind of bring that to the surface and really make it the focus, the focal point. What's most important, though, in putting the code of conduct in place is the process around it. So again, you know, I'm going to sound like a broken record. We start with the leaders, and we want them to kind of set that code of conduct up as being a really important thing. Not only because it is an important thing, but because that in making that public statement, those senior leaders have been co-opted into the process. They really need to follow their own advice in this regard. So leadership involvement is one big point here. I'd also say linking it to a training program that's launched at the same time really makes sure that the code of conduct is understood. And then there are some more kind of prosaic choices to be made. You know, you can think about whether you want the code of conduct to be principles based and just have it as a kind of very high level 1-page, 2-page document where we say, look, integrity matters to us. Or do you want it to be rules based and set out the details of how you want people to behave? If you go and look at Yara's code of conduct, you'll see that it's been set up as a rules-based document. It's actually a one-stop shop for all of your behavioral questions, right? So you don't need to go to the code of conduct and then to the gifts and hospitality policy or the conflict of interest policy. You just go to the code of conduct straight away. So that's been a really important decision on that code. If it's going to be rules based, you might find yourselves with some problems later on when you find breaches of those rules, those principles. It becomes very subjective and difficult to talk about. It's easier if you've got hard, fast rules. So those are a few notes on kind of codes of conduct. It's a massive area, so I mean, if you want me to expand on one of those, I'm happy to. But I think it's a tough one.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Great information. So Astrid, from a HR perspective, so looking at the code of conduct, we've now created it. We've just had a question actually, but you know, thinking to cover this from the HR perspective, how do we get employees to buy into the code of conduct?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to ensure that there's buy-in from your employees. I think one of the things that I've been involved with in previous companies is employees have been able to actively participate in the wording and the nuancing. I'm actually going to reference a company I've previously worked for, not just because I see she's here, but hello, Ariana. Ariana is a former colleague of mine from Amesto, and I know that she wrote the code of conduct at a time, I think 10 years ago when I was at Amesto. It was a really lovely policy. It was well nuanced. I believe that there'd been a lot of involvement in the employees in writing this. And I think that when it comes to buy-in, if employees agree and share the values and may even have values of their own to add, then I think it can be a lot more successful. I think there are other things you can do. Zeke might not agree with me here, but I think we have a version of our policies in something that we call the Manual for Ethics and Enjoyment. And it's to sound a bit less stern. It's because we're quite a playful company. It's a sort of newly released publication that we've posted online in Notion, which is where we post a lot of the information for our employees and new people. And as I said, it's not like a typical personnel handbook. We do still have a personnel handbook, but I think the problem was no one was reading it. It was very long. And this Manual for Ethics and Enjoyment is designed to shine a light very much on our culture. Not just don't do this and don't do that, but here's what we do. This is what it's like to be a part of the Shortcut environment, really highlighting the importance and the value of diversity and inclusivity. We make a lot of reference to multiculturalism within the organisation, how we treat each other. And we also lay out our anti-discrimination policies there, the kind of behaviour we do not tolerate from employees, for example. But as I said, it's in a playful way. You know, I think the area where we have policies against discrimination and behaviour, it starts with don't be a twatopotamus, be a decent human being. So we're just sort of trying to lay it out in terms that people find relatable. And we are also in the throes of having a code of conduct to back this, to make it even more strengthened as well. In previous roles, I've always found that the buy-in isn't difficult. I mean, I can't think of many or any incidents where someone hasn't wanted a code of conduct, so must make life very easy for people like you, Zeke. But also working in HR, I've had to deal with numerous cases, you know, sexual harassment in the workplace and you know, drug use in the workplace, and very hairy cases throughout my career. So I think for leaders, for people like me in HR, it's really important to have a code of conduct to refer to make reference to. You know, some people claim in these situations that they didn't know that what they were doing was wrong, but where you have a code of conduct in place, you have something to reference where you were able to say, you know, you clearly must have known that this was wrong, because here is what we say and here is how we make it quite clear. So I don't know, I haven't experienced buy-in problems myself, but I think the way you write it, the way you launch it, the way you get your employees to engage in it, the tone of it, making that right for your company. As I said, we're a tech digital design company. This sort of slightly more playful feel seems to work quite well for us. It might not work well in a much more sort of corporate environment, I suppose. I don't know, Zeke, you've probably got more to say than I have on this about the buy-in from people.
Yeah, I think it depends on the individual cultures, and that can also change within subsidiaries and in different kind of divisions and different countries, right? So some people might push back on it and say, I don't want that to be a complete rule book. I want that to be something softer as kind of guidance. It's a pretty dangerous route to go down, but it could help you get around. There might be some local issues with, say, approvals from works councils or unions where you really need to kind of anchor it thoroughly. France and Germany spring to mind in that regard, where you've got to get quite a few approvals if you're going to have a serious set of rules put in place. But no, I think generally people are happy to see it. What people are not happy with is if you put it in place in a messy process. So if you have inconsistent policies, or if you have policies which kind of haven't really been thought through, then people are going to be quite unhappy with that. I inherited a document which was more of the guidance style, which had complete contradictions on actually things like anti-corruption and what counted as corruption and what you could do and not do. And if you, a literal reading of that document would have implied that you could pay bribes so long as it was for critical business. So you've got to make it, it's got to make sense, right? You can also get people with their quite specific circumstances that they want to know in the process you've at least considered them, even if the policy in the end doesn't come out exactly as they wanted. They just want to know it's been considered. So, you know, if you're working in a very rural environment in Southeast Asia, the rules on health and safety, you might need to tailor those. Drink driving, interestingly, is not illegal everywhere. So you do need to kind of bring people to a point where they can say, actually, that rule we accept as you know, more stringent than our local law. So yeah, but those are a few extra comments, but generally buy-in is pretty smooth.
So global code of conduct then can be a little bit difficult if it's a company with, you know, multiple offices all over the world, because you're having to take into account all the different nuances of the countries.
Spot on, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Astrid and Ezekiel. So Chisholm, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but just before that, could I ask everybody to put your cameras on, please? Just want to get everybody back involved in the room. It's going to get everybody to do a bit of a shake up. We've had so much content coming at us, so get everybody to do a bit of a shake. This is so amazing. Thank you. Great to see everyone. Nice to see that you're all participating here. Great. So thumbs up, everyone, if you're enjoying the information that's been provided so far. Brilliant. People are enjoying it. Miriam, thank you. You shared an article with us here, a recent article from Deanne, which was stating that a consulting company, Bain & Company, introduced a new way of a recruitment method where you don't see the name, gender, age of the job seekers, and the results, as they say, are astonishing. So blind recruiting really works. Thank you. So moving on, Chiz, I'm going to come to you. So as an employer, and I know that you're running 3 separate businesses with a 1-year-old, people, can you believe it, with a 1-year-old? How do you ensure that, or do you actually try to ensure that your team have similar values and code of ethics to your business code of conduct?
Yes, I try being the key word. My day job, I'm an economist, and with the people I work with in that sector, I always have to, I think with all my companies and my staff, I always have to think about the best approach that works with our mandates, our mission, our vision. And that is often, it's not the easiest thing to do. So what I go for as a foundation is the same thing I use when I'm trying to build any relationship, be it professional or otherwise. I try to form it on the basis of shared values. I want to emphasize that shared values are different from company values. You know, shared values, at least to me, places emphasis on how I relate to my future team or employee. The company values deals with, you know, the organizational approach to achieving our overarching mission and vision. So yes, shared values is quite important to me, and I explore it by leveraging the specific company's vision, and then I fish to see how they relate to it. You know, say for Diversify in Her Space, our primary aim is to create a space where anyone can walk into and feel seen, heard, and celebrated as they are, you know, be they service provider or be they service recipients. You know, so our motto at Diversify is come as you are. Our motto at Her Space is come as you are or as you want to be. So of course, for me, it's very important that my team breathe and believe that on their own, not necessarily only just because they want to work at the company. But to be quite honest, I have not always gotten it right. It is really a process of trial and error. You know, sometimes having shared values does not necessarily translate to the workplace. There are people I have wanted it to work out with professionally who are just not a good fit. But what I do is I strongly encourage an open forum for discussion, and this comes back sometimes and bites me in the ass, but I know it's necessary. I also ensure to incorporate, you know, mentorship and continuous professional development for the team. I run some of the sessions myself, and I also contract services of other experts and coaches who run training sessions for me and for my team. I try to ensure that my team are a part of the decision making and that their opinion and their inputs matter. And sometimes they can override mine. You know, I think that for me, what is really important is that we all share the value of practicing what we preach. So we also try to collect as much feedback as possible, to assess not just my team's engagements with, you know, the company or with each other, but also with myself. And we also get feedback from our members or our clients to see how do you see us, just to see if we are actually giving, if we're practicing what we preach. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And so I want to stick with you because I wanted to ask you, is there a correlation, in your opinion, between representation, equity, and equality?
I would say yes. First, I should say that I find conversations around D&I quite fascinating, in case that wasn't clear. So I guess what I'm driving at here is that it's the paradox of diversity, you know, because there are many metrics, you know, age, ethnicity, race, gender. A company can actually have a diverse workforce without having a single woman in senior management or executive level. So companies need to consider representation as a part of its diversity package. And for those, you know, on here who are not aware of what representation in this context mean, I would like to clarify. So for example, if the goal of a company is hiring 50% women to their executive board, then that must also include not only women, of course, saying no, well, that must also include women of color, women of other races, women of other backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives that are outside the majority. And this holds whether the company is in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. Recruitment needs to go beyond hiring on a diversity basis and hire on a representative slate. Again, the question to ask yourself here is everyone in the room? And of course, you know, one of my all-time favorites quotes is, you cannot be what you cannot see. If you lead a company that hires women in entry-level positions, and perhaps middle-level management, but none in senior management or executive management, then you are doing your company and your bottom line a disservice. And on that note, you're also making it very difficult for women in the company to aspire to those positions because they cannot see themselves represented in it. So getting to that level really just becomes a big deal, whereas it really shouldn't be. So to answer your question, Hyacinth, about the correlation between representation, equity, and inclusion, I think we must first acknowledge that diversity is not enough. Sustainable change in recruitment mandates achieving equity, inclusion, and representation. Diversity is a numbers game that answers the question of who gets into the room and who gets to take space in it. So diversity is the who. Inclusion, looks at how those in the room take space through sound leadership. So that's the how. Equity is the end result and ensures fair and relevant access to opportunities, compensation, and resources.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for replying to that. I just want to say thank you as well for your transparency in letting us know as an employee that you haven't always gotten it right and that you are tweaking and learning as you're going along. And I really love that quote that you just said, diversity is not enough. And start from that standpoint. I really love that. It's very powerful. I want to say we've had a couple of people that have joined us a little bit later. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us in this conversation, this discussion. It's been very interesting so far, lots more to go. I know that some people, we're all at varying levels when it comes to understanding. Phila mentioned earlier that some people just don't even understand it. And so, we're all here today because we want to understand more, we want to learn more. So Astrid, for the people who are potentially relatively new or who really, really want to learn more about diversity, equality, inclusion, are there any resources that you could recommend for these people?
Yeah. Oh gosh. There's loads. Actually, Hyacinth. I mean, there's so many thought leaders in this space at the moment. Minda Harts and Lily Zheng are two of my favorites. You can actually just go to LinkedIn and in the search bar, just type diversity thought leaders and loads will come up. I'm loving Una King. She's now the VP of D&I at Snapchat, I think. She comes out with lots of great statements, great articles. You've also got Candice Morgan. She's head of diversity for Pinterest. She's really whooping things up there. She's working on a new sort of product that will develop features like skin tone to make the Pinterest app sort of more, make their search app more inclusive. And then you've got Michelle King, who's the former VP of D&I at Netflix. She's released a book recently called The Fix, which I haven't read, but is supposed to be really good. I think one thing I will say, Hyacinth, is that, I need to recognize as a white, middle-class, middle-aged, cisgender woman that I come from a point of privilege and that I belong to a majority group. At the same time, I do come into the arena as someone who's experienced gender discrimination. I've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. So, the fire in your belly can be what leads you to read and seek out stories from other people. And I think that power of listening to people's stories and listening to what they have to say, and also sharing your stories, being bold enough to share your story as some of your worst experiences and being vulnerable enough to do that, that is what helps keep a good conversation and a good dialogue going. I think in terms of one of the best books I've read recently, because I have to do a lot of reading for the I Am Remarkable workshop, a lot actually. I'm a really slow reader, which doesn't help. I read a book which a friend of mine recommended to me after the George Floyd killing, and after we were all reeling in shock, horror, disgust. And it's written by Igumo Oluo. It's called So You Want to Talk About Race. Chisholm, you're nodding because it seems like you know the book and you've read it. It's got some really incredible insights into how we can sort of leverage our privilege, how we can take action. And, you know, I think that's where a lot of my reading, I'm trying to direct a lot of my reading at the moment. I've spent the last 2 decades reading a lot about gender inequality. And I think, yeah, seeking out these books, looking at the thought leaders, telling your stories, but listening to other people is really important. And one thing I will say as well about pioneers and conversations is one of the things that I hear a lot of people say is they get very confused about the language and the terminology around diversity and inclusivity. And it is very confusing. You know, I read a lot around this and I get confused, and sometimes a new buzzword comes in and it is changing all the time. You know, if you're not sure, just ask. Don't be afraid to have the conversation because you're not sure what the right word is to use. Say to someone, you know, what is the correct terminology to use here? Because I will be honest, it seems to change a lot. I'm not always sure who it is that's changing it, but it does get confusing. And there are a lot of differences between the language that is used in the USA and the language that's used in the UK. And, you know, I had a conversation with an elderly person, an older person recently, that was telling me, oh, you can say, it's okay to say coloured again now. I sort of recoiled in horror and said, no, you don't say coloured. But they were confusing it with people of colour, which has sort of been, is much more accepted in America, and is a term that's been used a lot more as an all-encompassing term. So don't let your fear or shame about saying the wrong thing stop you from having a conversation, because I think that you have to be brave. Maybe you have to be rejected and have someone saying, well, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to share that with you. But I think sharing those stories and more importantly listening to those stories and listening without judgment is a really important place that we can start. And I just remembered one other book that I'm going to give a massive holler to. This is more on the gender side of things, but there's a fantastic book called Invisible Women, and it's by an author called Caroline Criado Perez. She's British. She's very well known for her sort of trailblazing work. Her book is called Data Bias in a World Designed by Men. A lot of the people at Shortcut, where I work, have read it because we're very involved in design and innovation. And what she talks about is maddening, because it talks about how everything from infrastructure to you know, military uniforms and you know, the way where the remote controls are in planes and helicopters are by and large designed by men and for men and based on the average white male body. So this is a really incredible read for anyone that wants to get a very sort of, it's a very factual overview on inconsistencies and disparities, really.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Lots of recommendations there. Orsi has also recommended a book, Here Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide. What we will do is, after this event, the team will send some information to everybody as a thank you for attending. We will send you as well all of these resources that have been recommended today, just so that you can then have your own list of resources. And just like Orsi, if you've got any suggestions of other resources, then please put them in the comments so we can add those to the list as well. Thank you so much. So Ezekiel, just wanted to, thinking of, you know, the last year that we had, 2020, and, you know, not just 2020, 2019, that recently there's been so many uprisings in various forms. What are some of the most common queries that are coming to yourself, with thoughts of BLM or Metoo Movement? And what are some resources that you would recommend from a compliance perspective?
Right. So, I mean, I think going back to the introduction, my angle on this is slightly different. It's the legal and the compliance side, right? So the questions that my clients come to me are usually focused on investigations, and this can be in the sense of anti-corruption investigations, or more people issues around harassment and discrimination. But the focus is on the process of the investigation. Now, of the couple of issues that have been talked about recently, the Metoo movement, BLM, those sorts of they're almost like a plateau of awakening, saying, look, okay, we're all super aware of this issue at this time. And especially in the Metoo movement, there was a great increase in whistleblowing related to Metoo. And it was whistleblowing of serious allegations mixed in with something that makes it really, really difficult to investigate, which is that many of them were legacy investigations and allegations. So saying, look, something happened 5 years ago, I've not been able to speak up about it until now. And I'd say that has been, one of the major challenges of the last few years are things coming up that are not recent. Memories fade. There is limited documentation. And I think you have to scope that work really carefully to make sure that you hear the relevant views and perspectives, but also that you don't kind of go everywhere, on a witch hunt looking for issues. So that's been a major challenge. I think the majority of my clients are interested in kind of seeing if anything is still going on now, and in setting up their programs to meet the new needs, as it were, or things that are where there's heightened awareness at the moment. And so I wouldn't get involved in building the program itself, but I would certainly be helping clients to investigate legacy issues, make sure nothing's going on now. Where there are issues going on now, that those are handled according to the law. But actually, the majority of my clients are really still dealing with legacy issues from those plateaus that happened kind of 20 years ago. There are companies out there still dealing with legacy issues from then. So when we see something come up in 2016 or in 2019 or 2020, those are going to be ongoing for quite some time. And things will come up, people will be gradually pushed over the edge where they say, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to report this. I want this dealt with. And, the challenge for someone in my line of work is the timeliness of the allegation. Much easier to deal with it if it's relatively recent.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of legacy issues, I'm currently reading a book at the moment called Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which will also be added to the list. And she talks about this in detail, just how detrimental it can be, these legacy issues. So thank you so much. So just going to change tact a little bit, and we are based in Norway, so I want to ask you, Chisholm, as this is an initiative from Diversify, what do you looking at the Norwegian market, what in your opinion, what's the awareness of diversity, inclusion and equity like here in Norway and the Norwegian workplace, in comparison to other places that you live, for example, the US, the UK?
Great question. So I should say that I love Norway. I moved here about 4 years ago now. I love a Norwegian man. I have a Norwegian baby. So it is in many ways, you know, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. So to answer this question, I think relative to the UK or the US, there is a perception that diversity and inclusion is not an issue in Norway. And the problem with that is that to be able to solve this challenge, you must actually accept that it exists. You know, I've been told by quite a few people in management level that the situation in Norway is not as complex as it is in, say, the US or the UK. You know, there's a reigning idea that Norway is post-racial, diverse, and inclusive Xanadu where women have, you know, equal opportunities in the workplace. However, this perceived utopia is far away from the reality. It is not post-racial. It's just not actively racist, say, relative to the US. It is not professionally diverse, and this is visible in the hiring practices of many companies. And on inclusion, only a relatively small number of companies have been able to achieve that. On gender equality in companies, Norwegian companies are not actually doing badly, especially when you compare them to companies across the world. However, gender equality often means an equal number of white Norwegian men and women represented at companies. And this is not representative of the people or the skills in the country. So one can argue that, you know, for a country of its size, a city like Oslo, Kristiansand, and Drammen, which are cities in Norway, are quite diverse because they have quite a lot of, you know, immigrants and people from different backgrounds and religion and cultures. But that diversity does not actually reflect in workplaces unless you are addressing low-skilled jobs. You know, it is not uncommon to see non-ethnic Norwegian or an immigrant, an expat Australian spouse with a bachelor degree, a master's degree, or even a PhD degree in, say, petrophysics, working at a restaurant or a kindergarten because they can't get hired anywhere else. And when I talk about immigrants, I think it is important that we change the perception of how we see and view immigrants. I don't refer to only the immigrants you see in the media who are fleeing war. I mean people like me. I mean Black, white, brown, gay, straight, highly intelligent men and women who do not actually get a chance because they are perceived to be different. You know, I think sometimes language is used as in an excuse for not being hired, but even when many people learn the language, they still do not get into the room. And for those who eventually get into the room, it's not uncommon that they take, say, up to 2 to 6 years to do so. I think that Norway is making progress, but real and difficult conversation needs to begin actively for this to change. You know, they say Rome was not built in a day. D&I in Norway, you know, it requires commitment and a long-term view. Companies must accept that they have much to learn and they need to invest the time and the money into training to become more diverse, inclusive, and equitable. You know, this necessary process should begin immediately and not pushed, you know, to a later date. I also want to say here that I have seen an increase in talks about diversity in Norwegian workplaces and a willingness to try and learn and understand. And I'm very encouraged by it. And I'm really hopeful that this translates really soon into actionable practices.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So, could you give us do you have any employment data from the Norwegian market?
Yes, I think I can give some data pre and post COVID as it affects or relates to immigrants in Norway. So pre-COVID, unemployment has relatively or I say historically been low in Norway. But unemployment pre-COVID among immigrants was twice as much as that of Norwegians. Yet immigrants make up only 16% of the Norwegian population. So as of February 2020, 41% of all unemployed people in Norway were immigrants, whereas there are about 800,000 in the population. Post-COVID, according to a recent-ish data from SSB, which is a statistical bureau in Norway, unemployment in the general population rose from 1.7 to 3.2%. In Q3 of 2020, over 122,000 people were registered as completely unemployed, and of those, 47,000 were immigrants. So which means that immigrants account for almost 39% of unemployed because of COVID. Yet they still represent only 16% of the population. So this said, I do also acknowledge that COVID has been tough on many countries, and I think Norway should be applauded, honestly, for how it has handled this situation and managed the virus, and also provided resources and support to its population. So I think a fair assessment would be to look at pre-COVID employment numbers, and on the basis that 41% of unemployed were immigrants, it is still indicative of an inherent and relative lack of diversity in the workplace. So there's room for improvement.
Definite room for improvement. Orsi's also just given us a comment. Some other stats: of the 213 public limited companies in 2017, just 15 were run by women, 7% of the total in this respect. Norway does far worse than many other countries, nearly all of which are supposedly less focused on gender equality. So we have 90 minutes left. And we've got a lot of questions that have come in. Please, we've not forgotten your questions. We're going to answer your questions. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask one more question to our panelists before we go to participant questions. And I think I'm going to touch on something that is quite interesting. Ezekiel, we're going to throw this one at you. And I'm excited to hear you answer this, and I think our participants will be as well. So, in light of recent events in the US of A, the insurrection, from a compliance perspective, if a team member has participated in something like an insurrection, from a compliance perspective, what can a company do to manage the fallout?
Right, it's my first ever question on an insurrection, so just bear with me on this one. I think, you know, first of all, I think as a fellow human being, you look at those pictures and you just despair at what's been going on. It's really instinctively kind of not okay. So as a human, that's the starting point. Legally, you're going to have some other issues. I think firstly, everyone's got the right to a private life. So that distinction between what's going on in the public space and what's going on in your private space is to be distinguished. An even stronger distinction exists between the workplace and your private sphere. So you really have some fundamental rights here that you're not going to be discriminated against for your political or philosophical beliefs. As a company handling this, I think most of us probably quite familiar with data protection laws by now. After the GDPR was implemented, you're not even allowed to compile information without very specific safeguards. You're not allowed to compile information. You have to be very, very careful with that sort of data. And so, you know, that activity in the private sphere is really quite protected from what's going on in the workplace. I think that there's another fundamental point, which is that you're talking here about extreme views, and that is subjective. You know, being the judge of that is extremely hard to do. A couple of cases that have come up that link into this distinction between the work life and the private life. There was a lawyer in the UK, a very successful lawyer, partner at a Magic Circle firm. He had a one-night stand with a colleague. She was a younger female, and he was disciplined for that. It was a drunken one-night stand. He was, he lost his job, and he was fined by the solicitors regulator. That case went to court, and I think just 2 weeks ago, all of the decisions against him were overturned, and he was awarded damages. The court, in delivering that judgment, said your private life is your private life, and it shouldn't be judged as a part of your work. And you can see the controversy and this grey area that's developing here that is going to need to be explored in other cases. And that thing I mentioned at the start, you instinctively react, oh my God, someone's involved in this activity, this insurrection. Other people would say, no, nothing to do with work, right? There's another example of the McDonald's CEO who had a string of relationships with various colleagues who lost his job. And again, Ines comes out of it winning. So there are some cases. I think it's still waiting to be settled, because these issues are part of the thing, and lots of grey areas there. But this generally the starting point is going to be around the contract of employment. If you're in a very regulated industry, or if you're in a position of trust or a fiduciary position, then you're going to be able to more quickly deal with this issue. I just want to check in, Hyacinth, if my sound is okay.
There were a couple of times where you dropped out, but only for a couple of seconds.
Okay, well, hopefully it holds up. I was saying that the contract of employment is the starting point. If you're in a really regulated industry, or if you're in a fiduciary position, a position of trust, it's much, much quicker to be able to deal with something like this. If you're in a position where your employer or your organization is saying, look, we can't have anyone with convictions, we can't have you doing things which brings the organization into disrepute, that is so much easier to deal with. But most employment contracts don't have those things in. So, more into Astrid's field, I think the contracts of employment, especially of senior people, really need to be handled way up front. But these issues are getting stronger and stronger. They're being discussed more. Your activity on social media, for example, is really going to affect and be brought into your working life. So on social media like LinkedIn or Twitter, where quite a lot of people put their opinion as an employee out there, that's going to be much easier to judge them on their private life, because they're bringing the workplace into it and bringing that organization into question. So fascinating area, and really difficult to deal with, not easy.
Yes, it is very fascinating. When you think, just like you say, it's an area that's kind of expanding, a lot more people with a lot of extreme views. So if you're aware that your colleague has extreme views, and those views are making other team members uncomfortable, how could a company mitigate, or how should a company respond to that?
Right, and I think that's going to be day to day with the line manager and their HR business partner to really manage those issues. I think those sorts of views are probably not going to be coming up to a corporate compliance team for investigation. But day to day, they're going to have to be managed into understanding what is it that belongs in the workplace and what is it that doesn't belong in the workplace, because it cuts ways, right? If we're to your private life, then please, refrain from bringing some aspects, some more extreme aspects of your private life into the workplace. But that's going to be pretty difficult. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ezekiel. Now, I want to give the listeners a chance to, we've got a stream of questions from you all, which, thank you. We're so happy to have these questions, but I'd like to give you a choice. Would you like the top 3 tips from each of our panelists from a compliance perspective, from a HR perspective, and from an employer's perspective, or would you like to have your questions answered? You could have your questions answered in the email that will be followed up, or you could have them answered now, or you could have the top tips emailed. What would you like to have now? Tips? One person saying tips, questions answered, tips, tips, tips. Come on. Tips. So far it's tips leading here. All right, so we'll go with tips because majority of people said that they would like the top tips. So Astrid, can I come to you? Could I ask you to give yours first? The 3 top tips from a HR perspective when it comes to implementing diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity.
Yeah, it's a really, really good one. I don't know where to start because there's I've got so many and it's such a long conversation. I think we all as individuals can be very mindful of not living in an echo chamber. If you're a guy, read more books where women are the central character. If you're white, watch more TV where it doesn't focus around white people. Stop following only people on social media who only look like you. Change things like this to start sort of unraveling the bias that you're interfacing with every day, because this will bring more sort of diversity, equity and inclusion into your everyday world. I'm going to go back to what I said about language, because I think language in this area stops a lot of people from feeling they can be brave enough to take up a discussion, and our uncertainty around using the right words or a fear of saying the wrong thing can stop a conversation that needs to happen. So, look up the terminology. There are so many companies and organizations that have glossary words. There's a website called Hive Learning where they constantly update the changing terminology. And I think on a third level, mentoring other people, I think, is such an important part of diversity, equity and inclusion. And this can really start from us as individuals. I'm going to give a little bit of a shout out to my mum, who I know is watching live on Facebook. Hello, Mum. You're about to get a mention here, Mum. You would have been mentioned even if you weren't joining, I promise you. But my interest in mentoring and my interest in this area, DE&I, really started with how I was raised. I was raised by a family who were very focused on giving back to the community. My mum and dad were volunteers at the local youth club. They did weekend support for children from underprivileged homes. They were foster parents. My mum worked with children with learning disabilities. So I was taught and I learned from an early age by growing up surrounded by people who were different to me. And I think that ethos and that personal grounding in our kids is such an important part of raising a new generation who are interested, have allyship and willingness. And it definitely resonates and translates to the work I do in this area, now as HR, now as someone that's looking at the diversity, equity and inclusion programs of our workforce and growing that amongst the turmoil of these very, very changing times that Zeke mentioned. I think those are my 3 tips, Hyacinth. Sorry if they're a bit waffly, but...
No, thank you so much, Astrid. Thank you. Ezekiel, I'm going to come to you. We've got 6 minutes left, so I'll give you 3 minutes and then we'll go to Chisholm. For the last 3 minutes, I just want to assure everyone your questions, we will answer your questions in the follow-up email. We will ask our panelists to answer the questions. We'll also send through the suggested materials for people to be able to delve into to learn more about D&I. So Zeke, we'll come to you. Top tips.
I'm going to do 1 tip and I'm going to answer a question to save us the admin later. So in terms of the tip, I think leaders have to take a position on this. If you're a line manager or if you're in any sort of leadership position, or actually, you know, if you're leading other people informally, really educate yourself, take a position on this, on diversity and inclusion, because it really matters. Change isn't going to happen without leaders taking a position. So that's my tip. For the question, Johan asked a question on legislation. And on legislation, I think that we've had a decade of sort of streamlined legislation in most European countries. Certainly in the UK, it's been 10 years of streamlined legislation and a clear system of tribunals. The law, however, is looking for binaries. It's looking for proof of a 1 or a 0, right? So you have to be able to say, look, this isn't good enough. There's been discrimination here based on age, disability, gender, ethnicity. You know, the law is looking for evidence-based 1 or a 0. And we have to question at this point whether that system has worked. Does it need a bit more time? And I think we're getting the answer through the socially driven pressure that's coming through. My instinct is that it's not quite there, it's not working. And that we need to approach a place where we change the evidential threshold, or we take another look at the law or the system of how it's working, to really assess these cases. Is there discrimination? Is there harassment? Those are really subjective questions. And I think the law is probably going to move more towards society in this case over the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much, Zeke. And Chisholm, we'll come to you. Please give us your, well, I asked for 3 top tips, but give us your however many tips it might be.
I'm gonna limit it to 3. I think on how to contribute to an equitable workplace. I think the first would be to do your diversity, equity, and inclusion research, learn, unlearn, relearn, be informed, you know, learn about history, the background, the context. We had no idea is no longer a valid response when Google is your friend. You know, my second point would be quantify and evaluate your data. You need to understand where you are in terms of metrics. This requires collecting and analyzing data of your team or employees so you can evaluate the demographics information of your organization, including your leadership team. Once you have the data, you can set goals and metrics within D&I that you'd like to attain. So set measurable targets and hold yourself accountable to them. And my third one would be, oftentimes you hear recruiters or people in management positions say they hire for culture fit. What I think is that do not hire for culture fit. Instead, hire for culture contribution. As a hiring manager, the goal isn't to hire your clone. The goal should be to hire the person, the best person for the role and for the team. So what this means is that you need to hire employees that not only align to your company values, but also bring bring, you know, diverse experiences and backgrounds to the table too. Ask yourself, what does this new hire bring to the team that we don't already have? But if you're looking across the table to a potential new hire and exactly like you, or exactly like 3 other people at your company, then you're doing it wrong. So those would be my top 3 tips.
Wow, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of today's event. Thank you guys for engaging. This was a phenomenal event. I was writing notes like crazy throughout, and we will follow up with everybody. We will send you more information. We'll send you a follow-up email, like I said, with all of those resources, with the tips and suggestions. We'll answer some questions, and the next session is actually there, which is deconstructing unconscious bias. If that's going to be quite a spicy conversation. So if I was you, I'd register from now. The link is in the comments, posted by Nikki, one of the team from Diversifying Her Space. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating. People from the UK, from Denmark, from Sweden, from Malaysia, from Brussels, from the USA, from Croatia, from Romania, from the Netherlands, from Italy, and of course from Norway. Thank you all. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. And if you have any contributions that you would like to be added in terms of resources, please send us an email to Diversify, which would just be contact@diversify.no. Okay, great. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.